I'm Mark Harrison, and on Christmas Eve I ended up on the floor in front of my entire family with gravy staining my shirt and my hip screaming in pain. My stepson Ethan had just shoved me away from the head of the table, telling me that seat belonged to his father and I needed to get out. For a moment nobody moved. I looked up at Ethan's smirk and waited for my wife Susan to speak up for me. She never did. Instead, she grabbed napkins and started cleaning the gravy off the hardwood floor like the spill was the real problem. That moment changed something fundamental inside me. Cedar Rapids, Iowa has always been my home. I'm 56 years old and I've always lived by straightforward principles. Show up when you're supposed to, keep your promises, and pay what you owe ahead of schedule. That's why the chair meant so much to me. It had belonged to my father, an old wooden piece with worn armrests and a squeaky back left leg. When Dad was in hospice, he'd sit in that chair by the window. After he passed away, I brought it to my garage, tightened all the joints, stained it walnut, and replaced the seat cushion. When Susan and I married, I brought that chair into her split-level home. For years during holidays, it sat at the head of the table. 2 summers before, I'd used a significant chunk of my savings to renovate Susan's kitchen. I installed solid cabinets, a new faucet, and better lighting. Susan cried when she saw the finished work and told me she could finally have family over without feeling embarrassed. Ethan was supposed to be part of our blended family. He's 32 years old and built like someone who still thinks his high school football glory days might somehow return. He bounced between jobs and somehow always ended up back in Susan's orbit whenever money got tight. He never called me Dad, just Mark. I even helped him when he was younger, teaching him basic skills and giving him my old drill when he moved out. I covered bills here and there when Susan begged me to keep the peace. Then Ethan's biological father, Derek, started showing up again. Derek was loud and confident, the type of person who acted like he owned whatever room he entered. Susan explained he'd been mostly absent during Ethan's childhood, but lately he'd been making up for lost time. This particular Christmas, Derek insisted on coming to dinner. Susan told me it was important to Ethan. I pointed out that I was important too. She gave me that tight little smile that meant she wanted me to avoid conflict. By 5 in the afternoon, the house was hot from the oven and the turkey smell hung thick in the air. I made coffee the way Susan preferred it, strong and plain. Ethan arrived last with Derek right behind him. Ethan slapped Derek on the shoulder and announced there was the man of the hour. We took our seats and someone said a quick prayer. I reached for the carving knife and that's when Ethan's hand shot out and grabbed the back of my father's chair. He told me to hold up. I looked at him confused. Ethan's eyes were bright and mean. He nodded toward Derek and announced that seat belonged to his dad. He told me to get out, his voice loud and clear. I started to laugh because my brain hadn't caught up. He shoved me, not playfully but with real force. The chair scraped backward and my boot caught on the rug. My hip slammed into the floor and pain shot up my side. Gravy splashed across my shirt. Somebody gasped. Ethan stood over me breathing hard. Susan didn't even look down at me. She grabbed napkins and wiped the spill, her face calm and almost blank. I pushed myself up. My dignity burned hotter than my bruised hip. I looked at Susan, waiting for a word. She kept her eyes on the floor. In that blinking Christmas light silence, I understood something I'd refused to see for years. To them, I wasn't family. I was maintenance, someone who fixed things and paid for things but didn't actually belong. So I stood slowly and walked out into the Iowa cold without saying a single word. My truck door shut with a hollow thud, and for a moment, I just sat there in the driveway. Behind the window, I could still see the table, shapes moving and heads turning. My hip pulsed. At 56, you don't bounce back. I started the engine and backed out, the tires crunching over frozen slush. I ended up at a convenience store for coffee. My phone buzzed. It was Susan. I watched it ring until it stopped. Then Ethan called, then Susan again. I didn't answer. I drove home to my home, the small ranch house I'd owned long before Susan. On the way in, I passed the thin folder containing receipts from that kitchen remodel at Susan's place. Receipts documenting the new faucet, new sink, cabinet hinges, and a backsplash I set tile by tile after work. I remembered Susan telling me she didn't know anybody would do that for her. I'd done it because I believed we were building something together. Seeing those receipts tonight felt like looking at proof I'd paid my way into a family that still called me a guest. I limped inside and checked the bruise in the bathroom mirror. Purple was already spreading across my hip, wide as my palm. I sat in my recliner with an ice pack. My phone buzzed again. A text from Ethan telling me I'd embarrassed his dad and should have just moved. Then another message stating I was just a guest in this family, a guest who'd overstayed. I read it twice. I didn't write back. Around midnight I tried to sleep but couldn't get comfortable. I got up and made coffee, strong and plain, the way my dad drank it. I told myself it was just a chair, just a stupid holiday moment. But it wasn't about the chair, it was about the sentence Ethan said out loud that everyone had been treating like an unspoken truth. You don't belong. Susan finally texted, asking me to please come back and talk, saying Ethan didn't mean it and he'd been under stress. She claimed he didn't mean it like a shove is something you do by accident. Beneath the hurt and shame, something else started to rise. An old line my father used to say, "Your name is your word, Mikey. Guard it." Just after 6 in the morning, my phone chimed with a sound I recognized but hadn't heard in years. A credit alert. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. My credit score had taken a hit. New inquiry, new account activity. I sat back and felt colder than the snow outside because in my world that didn't happen unless something had been opened in my name. My phone was buzzing again, call after call. Susan, Ethan, Susan, an unfamiliar number with a local area code. I didn't answer yet. By mid-morning, the call log looked like a slot machine that wouldn't stop spinning. 23 missed calls. Ethan had called 12 times. I tapped Ethan's voicemail first. His voice came through too fast, telling me to call him back, saying it was some banking thing. The next one explained it wasn't what it looked like and he just needed me to talk to somebody. The third voicemail made me snort. He complained they froze his account and he couldn't get gas, demanding I fix it. Then he slipped. He called me Dad, then corrected himself back to Mark, pleading with me. All those years he couldn't spare me that title, but the minute money got tight, his mouth reached for it like a reflex. Then the unknown number called again. This time I answered. A woman's voice came through, professional and careful. She identified herself as Emily from the Community Credit Union. She explained there'd been a delinquency notice issued on a personal loan where I was listed as the guarantor. I asked what I was listed as. She clarified I was a co-signer. The loan was past due. I asked how much the loan was. She told me $18,400, opened 8 months ago with the first payment missed last month and the second missed this week. $18,000 wasn't gas money. I asked if this affected my score. She said quietly that, yes, it did, because I was tied to it. I told her I didn't co-sign anything. There was a pause. She explained the loan file included my name and a signature attributed to me. If I believed that signature wasn't mine, they had procedures. I told her I'd be there. I didn't call Susan or Ethan. I put on jeans, a flannel, and my work boots. The credit union parking lot was mostly empty. Emily met me in the lobby and led me to a small office. She apologized that this was happening the day after Christmas. I replied that I just wanted to see it. She slid a folder across the desk. On top was a loan summary with Ethan's name, Susan's name, and there it was. My name typed neatly under guarantor. Emily turned the monitor and a scanned document appeared showing the signature page. My signature sat at the bottom in black ink, except it wasn't mine. Emily watched my face and asked if that was mine. I told her no. She nodded and asked if I ever signed as Mikey. My throat tightened. I told her only my father called me that, and I hadn't signed that name since I was a kid. She pointed at the line, and there in shaky cursive was Mikey Harrison. My skin went cold. Emily asked softly who had access to my information. I told her my wife. She just opened a drawer and set a form on the desk, explaining this was a statement of fraud. If I signed it, they'd open an investigation. My phone buzzed with another call from Ethan. I looked at the pen, then at the Mikey signature on the screen. I told her I wasn't deciding out of anger, but because my name meant something. I took the pen, I signed the fraud statement with a steady hand and a sick stomach. Emily explained that an investigator would call and I'd need to provide samples of my normal signature. In my truck, my phone lit up again with Susan calling. I answered. She asked where I was, saying Ethan couldn't access his account and Derek was losing it. I asked why my name was on an $18,000 loan. There was a pause that said more than any confession. Susan whispered she was trying to help, that Ethan needed it and Derek said he'd cover it. I asked if she signed my name. She said I would have said no, like that explained everything. I replied that's because no is a complete sentence, and my name isn't a community resource. I drove straight to Susan's house. When I walked in, Ethan was waiting with red wild eyes. He snapped, asking if I was happy, saying they froze everything. Derek was behind him pacing. In the corner, like somebody had shoved my history out of the way, was my father's chair, moved and exiled. Ethan saw me looking and smirked, commenting they'd moved my little throne. I told him it was my dad's chair. Ethan's laugh was sharp as he said my dad was dead, and his was right there. Derek jabbed a finger at me, barking that you don't do this to family. Ethan stepped closer with his voice rising, repeating I was a guest there, insisting that seat was never mine. Susan stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel twisted in her hands. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I told her to explain to him, to tell him whose name was on that loan. Susan's mouth opened, then closed. Ethan's face shifted as panic slid under the arrogance. She finally whispered that she signed it. Ethan stared at her, then at me. He said I told them it was fraud, accusing me of making his mom a criminal. I told them I told the truth, that I didn't sign anything. Ethan shouted I could have covered it, that I always cover it. I turned and walked out. In the truck, my phone buzzed with a new voicemail from Ethan. This one wasn't angry but desperate, asking me to just tell them I signed it, swearing he'd pay me back, begging me not to do this because it was embarrassing. Embarrassing. Not wrong, not illegal, just embarrassing. I went to the VFW post. Bob Carter was there, 72 years old and a retired attorney. I slid the folder to him. He skimmed, then tapped the signature page, pointing out that wasn't me. Bob leaned back and told me this wasn't family stress, but identity misuse. He warned if I let it slide, it wouldn't stop. I muttered I wasn't trying to blow up my life. Bob nodded and said I didn't. They did. He told me all I was doing was quitting the job of protecting them from consequences. I wrote down dates, Christmas Eve, the shove, the calls, the loan, every detail. Then Emily called again, informing me the review was now formal, and an investigator would contact me that day. Not 10 minutes later, a new number rang. The voice identified himself as Investigator Brooks, asking to meet that day. My meeting with Investigator Brooks happened in a plain conference room at the credit union. He set a small recorder on the table and explained he was going to ask questions about the loan file and my signature. I told him I wasn't there to stop. He asked me to walk him through Christmas Eve. I kept it simple with times, names, and what was said. Then he told me to sign my name 10 times. My pen moved the way it always had, Mark Harrison, steady and practiced. Brooks compared it to the Mikey signature and stated that wasn't a match. He asked who had access to my information. I told him the truth, my wife. When we finished, he explained they'd forward their findings to the county attorney. He said that didn't guarantee charges, but it could. My phone buzzed with calls from Susan, Ethan, and Derek. I didn't answer. I went to the VFW where Bob was reading the paper. I showed him the case number and the messages where Ethan swung between rage and begging. Bob snorted, saying threats don't fix fraud. I told him I didn't want Susan destroyed. Bob looked at me and said wanting consequences isn't wanting destruction, but once you tell the truth, you don't get to steer the system. The next week felt like Cedar Rapids shrank around me. At church, people smiled too hard. Susan's sister told someone I was punishing Susan. I kept my head down and saved every text. On January 9th, a letter came with the county seal showing a date, time, and courtroom number. I called Bob and told him it was happening. The courthouse looked like it always does, old limestone with a flag snapping above worn steps. Susan sat on a wooden bench with puffy eyes. Ethan paced in a suit that didn't fit his attitude. Derek stood beside him with arms crossed. Ethan spotted me and hissed, asking if I was really doing this. I told him I wasn't doing anything, just answering for my name. Susan reached for my sleeve and whispered, pleading with me, saying she'd make payments. I looked at her and felt that old reflex to rescue her. Then I remembered her eyes on the floor while I lay in gravy. I lowered my voice and told her I wasn't doing this to Ethan, but for the man I used to be, the one who worked 40 years to have a name that means something. Her face crumpled. The bailiff called our case and we filed into the courtroom. The judge looked down at the file and addressed me, confirming I was contesting a guarantor signature. I confirmed that was correct. Ethan's attorney stood and told the judge this was a family misunderstanding, claiming Susan believed she had permission. The judge raised a hand and stated, "Belief is not consent," asking if they had proof. I agreed. The attorney hesitated, admitting there was no written proof. The judge turned to Ethan and asked if I agreed to co-sign. Ethan swallowed and admitted not directly. Emily testified about dates, the Mikey signature, and the missed payments. Investigator Brooks confirmed the signature comparison. Ethan's attorney tried one last approach, asking if this wasn't really about a Christmas argument. I said there was an argument and a shove, but I was there because my name was used to take a loan I never agreed to. The judge asked if I had additional evidence regarding intent. I said I did. I handed a flash drive to the bailiff and explained it was audio from my doorbell camera outside Susan's home the night of Christmas Eve. Ethan's head snapped up. The speaker crackled as a door closed, then Ethan's voice came through laughing. He said the old man was too weak to do anything. Derek's voice followed, saying I'd pay it like I always do. Ethan added that I was just maintenance. The courtroom went quiet. Susan covered her mouth and Ethan's face drained. The judge clicked the file closed and said that was sufficient. She looked at Ethan and told him those statements showed he expected me to absorb a debt I didn't consent to, stating that was intent. She turned to Susan and told her she'd placed her spouse at financial risk, and this matter would be referred appropriately. As the bailiff guided us out, I caught myself rubbing my thumb over my wedding band. I thought of my father's chair, how it used to creak when he leaned back. Ethan had tried to take my place with a shove. The court had handed it back with a sentence. Outside, cold air hit my lungs sharp and clean. My hip still hurt, and my heart still hurt, but I stood straighter than I had in years. The next week, Cedar Rapids went back to being Cedar Rapids. But my world didn't. Susan moved like a ghost after the hearing. She stayed at her sister's for a while. The house looked the same, but the air in it didn't. Ethan didn't call for 3 days. On the 4th day, I got a text saying I didn't have to play that audio. A minute later, he replied that Derek said I was dead to them. I read that twice, then set the phone down. My hand wasn't shaking anymore. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something like grief that had finally stopped arguing with reality. 2 nights later, Susan showed up at my door with red eyes and a grocery bag. She asked softly if she could come in. I stepped aside and she sat on the edge of my couch. She'd brought my favorite crackers and peppermint tea. She whispered she'd messed up. I didn't answer right away. She continued, explaining Ethan was crying and Derek was yelling and she panicked. I told her she handled it and I got hurt. Tears slipped down her cheeks and she said she didn't want me to leave but didn't want to lose her son either. I said so she picked the option where she could lose me quietly. She apologized, acknowledging sorry didn't fix it. I agreed it didn't. She told me she'd do whatever I wanted, counseling, payments, sell her jewelry. I interrupted her and told her this wasn't about money. She looked up confused. I explained it was about me being on the floor while she acted like the spill mattered more than my body, about Ethan learning he could shove me and she'd smooth it over, about my name. She said she didn't know what to do. I told her she could have looked at me, could have said my name. Then she said the quietest thing, whispering she didn't want Derek to win, so she let him. The county attorney didn't throw Susan in jail. She cooperated and agreed to restitution terms. She had consequences: mandatory financial counseling, no more access to my credit, and a formal separation agreement. That paperwork felt like a coffin lid closing on the marriage I thought I had. Ethan lost more than he expected. He had to sell his truck to cover part of what he owed. The job he'd been bragging about went to someone else when the background check flagged the mess. He blamed me for every bit of it. Weeks passed and snow melted into dirty patches. I was living alone in my little ranch house again, only now the silence wasn't lonely. It was honest. One Saturday morning I asked Bob to go with me to retrieve my father's chair. We met Susan at her place. Ethan wasn't there and Derek wasn't there. The chair sat in the corner of the living room. I ran my hand along the worn armrest. Susan told me I could take it. I nodded and replied I was taking it home where it belongs. On the drive home I realized that chair was never my power. It was my memory. Ethan couldn't steal it by sitting in it. That night I made coffee and sat in the chair by my living room window. My phone buzzed late with a text from Ethan saying he didn't think I'd actually do it. I typed back that neither did I until he forced my hand. After a long pause, another message came saying his mom wasn't okay. I replied telling him to tell her to take care of herself and that I hoped she learned peace doesn't come from covering things up. Ethan didn't answer. In March, Susan and I finalized the separation. It wasn't a screaming divorce, just paperwork and signatures. She cried. I didn't, not because I didn't feel it, but because I'd already cried on a kitchen floor no one noticed. Bob asked if I was okay. I told him I would be, that I already was in a way. Because the strangest part was what I didn't feel anymore. I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. I went home, made a cup of coffee, and sat in my father's chair in perfect, unbroken silence. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence of peace. I thought about that Christmas table, that shove, that moment Susan wouldn't say my name. I don't hate them because hate keeps you tied to people. What I learned is simpler and harder. Respect is a two-way street, and if you burn your side, don't expect me to keep mine open.